Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me thank, first and foremost, the Italian consul. My good friend Sergio Federico wanted me here. That's my first time in Australia, so I'm twice glad to be here. Thanks to Professor Flake, who was so kind to introduce me. What am I going to talk about tonight? Professor Flake said, considering that I'm hailing from Rome, I wanted to get big, and I figured that the best way to talk about the Indo-Pacific was to link the future of the Indo-Pacific to the world. But it's not only a matter of us being, I don't know, less than sober. It's the truth. The Indo-Pacific to us, and I think that to the rest of the world as well, is the most important theater in the world as of today. And I think it'll stay this way for the next, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 years. Why is that? We'll try and understand why it is so, and we'll also try to figure out what will happen. When I say what will happen, let me just be boring, or even more boring, for a couple of minutes. I deal in geopolitics. What the hell is that? Considering that now geopolitics is trendy, you can find geopolitics everywhere you go, either at the restaurant or I don't know, if you flip through a magazine. Once I was invited to a conference on the geopolitics of golf. So being trendy, you can literally put wherever you want. But what does geopolitics do, and what is this all about? Usually when you have in front of you someone that is an expert in geopolitics, is a very bad day. Why? Because geopolitics tends to revolve around wars and crisis and military theaters and so forth. I tried, which is, of course is not that relevant, but just I'm telling you this just because I want you to I want to set the tone for the night. I will be upbeat, so I won't talk about wars and tragedies and so forth. But also because I try to insert into the geopolitics I deal with a human touch. Usually geopolitics, to me at least, tends to focus way too much on leaders, militaries, military operations, and the likes. But people tend to be, I wouldn't say discarded by geopolitics, but sometimes overlooked. And even if we're not that used to this sort of approach, especially in the Western world, the way we study history in high school and university in the Western world is very much focused on leaders, kings and queens and heroes and military commanders. The pages of our histories are filled with those figures. But we tend to overlook peoples. Where were peoples throughout history? If we go beyond the Western world, if we are lucky to open up an history book from, I don't know, China or Ethiopia, the first, of course, if we can read them, but the first thing that comes to us is that those very books are less focused on leaders and individuals than ours. And I think that's the right approach. So today, you won't hear from me, that's why I'm telling you this, any parts of this speech, of this intervention on Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or Xi Jinping or whoever you want to like to talk about. Because I tend, of course, with all the flaws that I bear, some of them are visible, some are not. I tend to focus on the megatrends, on the feelings of people, and on what the major powers of those world have to or want to do. And also when we talk about Indo-Pacific, let's not hide from confrontation. When we talk about Indo-Pacific, of course, we're talking about the US and China competition. We all know that. AUKUS was mentioned before at least a couple of times, rightfully. AUKUS is invented into the US and China competition. It's not something that, of course, was invented overnight just for the sake of it. That doesn't mean that it's going to be war. It's not written on the stone, as we say in Italy. There's no way that the war is something to take for granted, thank God. And probably there won't be a war between China and the US, probably. But tonight we're trying to understand what are the powers involved in the Indo-Pacific. Which power is with which other power? Whether war is inevitable, or as I said, that's a spoiler, it's not inevitable at all. And what we can fairly assess from here that it's going to happen in the next years. First question, which power dominates the Indo-Pacific? Before my speech, Consul Nicolacci said, he used a little sentence that I bet you all noticed. He said, under the illusion of the end of history. The illusion of the end of history is something, well, the expression comes from German philosopher Hegel, Frederick, by the way. I'm kidding. But yeah, it comes from Hegel. Then, after the Cold War, it was resumed by an American political scientist, Francis Fukuyama. Basically, when we talk about the end of history, what we mean, if we're not versed in history or geopolitics, or just being nice, what we mean is that we believe that the human biology, that the human nature has changed. So we're at the end of history because we have changed, we have evolved for the better, and now we know how to cohabit in this world, and we will be very pacific in our living on this world. But if we want to be, let's say, more realistic, the syndrome of the end of history happens each and every time a major power is way above the other powers. If we were to ask a person hailing from Egypt in the 2nd century of our age, we're talking about the highest peak of the Roman Empire. Of course, we should have used Greek to communicate with such a person. But if we were to ask them, is the history over? Probably they would have said yes. Because when you have a major power above the other powers, violence, major violence among powers is not permitted. Back in the 90s, the US were way above the other powers. And major violence among major powers was not allowed. So we had the feeling that history was over. Now we have the opposite feeling. We see competition, we see Russia invading Ukraine, we see Iran attacking Israel through Hamas. We see China, diplomatically at least, if not militarily, backing Russia in Ukraine. We also see Russia having a very good relationship with Iran, and Russia also reminding us that Taiwan is part of Russia, and that Taiwan, rightfully, in their consideration, should return, they use the verb return, to China by 2049. Why 2049? Because it's the anniversary, 100 years, of the Maoist revolution. So if we were used to the end of history, Now we witness something that looks like the opposite of the end of history. Australia is a very likely place. It's on the other side of the world. It's down under. Wars look very far away from here. But the rest of the world, especially Eurasia, is mired, unfortunately, in wars again. Russia brought war on the European soil again after, well, if you ask an average European, they would say after 70 years. That's not true. We had a war in the former Yugoslavia 3 years ago, but still, Russia brought war back to Europe after at least 3 decades. And Europe is still the most important continent of the world, which sounds counterintuitive, considering that we're talking about the Indo-Pacific here. The Indo-Pacific is the most dangerous and crucial part of the world. But you don't have to trust me. The US controls and dominates Europe. Even though we Europeans, we tend to pretend that's not true. But the US does not dominate the Indo-Pacific. The US is so far the only superpower of the world. And if the Indo-Pacific were to be the most important continent, the US couldn't be such a superpower, considering that it does not dominate this part of the world. It's a matter of logic. But here insists and hails the major competitor of the US, China. If we were to look at the Cold War, paradoxically, or maybe not even paradoxically, the strategic situation of the US was easier than the one of today. Why is that? Europe was the most important continent of the world. And the major competitor of the US was Europe. Soviet Union, of course. Of course, the Soviet Union, it went from Europe to the eastern tip of Asia. But 70% of the Russian population was Europe. And Russians, no matter what they say, they consider themselves European. Nowadays, the US still considers Europe the main continent, but their major competitor is in Asia. That makes for a more complex strategic situation for the US. If we were to look at grammar, a strategic grammar, if we have two major enemies, and the US has got two major enemies today, they're competitors. Maybe Russia is even an enemy, I don't know. But you got China and Russia. Grammar states that you have to get towards the weakest one of them, or the weaker, and get the weaker one towards you, as to separate the two major enemies we're facing. When did the US win the Cold War? 1969. What happened back then? The Americans back then used to look at the world as if they were political scientists, i.e., not people actually versed in the world. They thought ideologically Russia was a communist country, China was a communist country. They were friends. Then something happens. 1969. The Soviet Union and China get into a war. They fought each other around a couple of rivers on the border of the Soviet Union and China. A German strategist, he wasn't a strategist, at least according to me, but he was a very intelligent person, Henry Kissinger, working for the US administration, had an alignment. He saw two communist powers fighting each other. He figured they could be separated. In 1971, he flew to Beijing Back then, the US did not recognize the People's Republic of China as a legitimate state. There weren't embassies between those two countries. He flew to Beijing. By the way, it was in Pakistan. Then it disappeared. The American news edition of that night said that Mr. Kissinger was to stay in Pakistan for unsighted reasons. He secretly flew to Beijing. His trip is legendary. He fell in love, of course, intellectually, with the Chinese premier and Lai. He loved to talk with him. Hours. Kissinger, as of many intelligent people, used to get corrosive, used to ask millions of questions to Lai. One of them, the legend has it, revolved around the French Revolution. 1789. It was 1971. What do you think of the French Revolution? The Chinese interpreter thought it was an odd question. And he figured that Kissinger was referring to the riots in Paris 3 years before, prior to that meeting. And he translated the question about that event. And Lai, in English, as for the interpreter, replied, "It's too early to judge." Kissinger has been telling this part now, of course, he left us, but he used to tell this part for many, many years. He used to tell his American friends, not only American friends, see, Chinese memory is so long that 200 years is nothing. They're still pondering what to make of the French Revolution. Let's call it lost in translation. But why am I telling you this? Because thanks to this engagement, the US won the Cold War. They separated China from Russia. Why was China want to be separated from Russia? Because they touch each other. They're close. Their empires, they're very close. They have border disputes. They do not trust each other. They're now friends. They're not friends, not even today, no matter what Putin or Xi Jinping say. They tend to be competitors. Today, for the US, the situation is more complex. Strategic grammar would say that now the weaker one first is Russia, and China is the stronger one. The situation is the other way around nowadays. So if you were to follow grammar, the US should open up to Russia. And there are parts, as Professor Flake would testimony, there are parts of the US security apparatus that thinks that could be a viable option. Let's just put Trump aside for a while. Trump would like to open up to Russia. It's not an interpretation, it's said so many times. That's not really important. US presidents are not emperors. Trump wanted to open up to Russia the first time he got elected, and he got impeached because of it. As you all remember, he was on the phone with President Zelensky that got elected some days before, and he threatened, President Zelensky said, "I'm not delivering the weapons that Congress allocated for you if you do not investigate on Biden's son, Hunter Biden." The US has got 16 different intelligence agencies and branches. One of them was listening to Trump, and they referred to what he said to Congress, and he got impeached. Trump called them the deep state. They were just doing their job. Trump was putting his personal interest above the national interest. But he still wants to open up to Russia. Why the U.S. security apparatus is not on board, at least not yet. They haven't been on board so far. It's not only a matter of being educated, considering the Russians, let's say, a power that cannot be trusted. And they're right in thinking this way, considering what the Russians were doing in Ukraine. But that's not only that. They think that if they were to open up to Russia, and if Russia were loose and free to move around the world, especially Europe, Russia, being an empire, they're faring very badly nowadays, but they're still an empire. They would complicate the situation, not only Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific. Russia doesn't really have a navy, but Russia can provide China with all the best that China needs. What is it? Wheat and oil. Since the war in Ukraine broke out, China has been ramping up the import of oil from Russia, especially gas, to be honest with you, mostly gas, and wheat. Oh, by the way, where do Russians grow wheat? In Siberia. But there are still some among us, not in this room, I guess, that deny global warming. Wheat is being grown in Siberia, and has been grown in Siberia for many years now. Has been shipped to China. Of course, Chinese pay for it. So the Americans think that Russia is already playing a role in the Indo-Pacific, even though indirectly. Because Americans fear, that they might face China the next few years being reinforced by the best that Russia can export to them. So what is going on in the Pacific? You all noticed that many countries around the Indo-Pacific, if not all of them, are economically dependent, as of trade, for example, dependent on China. But most of them, they tend to get close to the US military-wise. Let's make some examples. The Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. Singapore is not even a state, but Singapore. Malaysia. They're all dependent economically on China. They were very close to the US when it comes to their military. Why is that? If you were in a international relations faculty in the Western world, we're the only ones that believe in what I'm about to say, we would say that that's because the US is a free country and China, to our standards, is not. But that's not true. The US is a free country, of course. China, to our standards, is not. But that's not the reason why those countries tend to get close to the US. Vietnam is a communist dictatorship by constitution. It's not my interpretation. It's written in the Constitution. Communist dictatorship. I do not think the Vietnamese judge China the same way we could or we might in the Western world, or the Philippines for that matter, or Singapore, or Indonesia. Indonesia is the most populated Muslim nation in the world. I doubt they use the same lenses of ours when they look at other nations, especially when they look at China. So why are those countries close to the US? Let's go back to grammar. Human beings have been on this earth for many, many years, to say something very stupid and obvious. So we have collected a lot of experiences. So we should know that if you have to choose between two enemies, or among 3, 4 enemies, I don't know, but at least between two enemies, you always choose the furthest one. Period. There's no other way. There's no other reason. Why is that? Because the power that's the farthest from you one day won't be able to get here, will disappear. If you end up under a major power geographically close to you, you got no escape. Let's look at the world from Vietnam. You got China on your head. There are 1 billion for 100 million people. You fought a war against China 40 years ago. You also fought a war against the US. You also fought a war against France before the US. And you won all of them, by the way. Not because Vietnamese are superhumans, but because their terrain and soil is very hard to control if you're not born there. But anyways, if you're Vietnam and you're to choose between the US and China, who would you choose? China will be there forever. The Americans won't. That's how major powers tend to look at the world. But if we like to think that they love our Western values, we're free to do so. It allows us to have a nice chat at dinner with our friends, and also to get a degree. But that's not the real world, especially if you want to transcend the Western world, if you want to look around you. That's the main perk of being the US. The US lives on Mars. What does that mean? For the first time in history, we have a power that is the major power of our time, which does not hail from the Eurasian platform. It never happened before, ever. That's the major perk of the US. That's the reason why countries tend to choose the US, because they're far away. They're always far away. That's the reason why in Indo-Pacific they got this perk. Of course, they're a democracy, but the Philippines, let's talk about this. Anyways, the Philippines got American soldiers on their soil. What can happen? The problem with China is that China, and then quickly I'll wrap up my speech, China doesn't really have allies. Not only because in the Chinese language, and Kissinger would be very proud, the very same word is non-existent in the Mandarin. Not only because of that. Because China, as it happens, and it happened with many great empires and civilizations of history, did not tend to look at their powers at the same level of its. But that's not only that, I would say. It's because China is too big. Even though China maybe is not an aggressive power, China hasn't waged a major war since the one that I mentioned against Vietnam. But still, if you're so big, you're scared. It's not your fault. You are. And someone that deals in strategy always tends to look at the bad weather. Otherwise, she or he, they've got the wrong job. You always look at the bad weather. What can go wrong? So if you look at China, there are a lot of things that could possibly go wrong. What can happen revolves around Taiwan. Taiwan is definitely the most dangerous island in the world. We are Westerners, not all of us, but many of us inside this room. And the U.S., especially the U.S., but not only the U.S., the U.S. has taught us to look at things through economics, through an economical lens. So if we were to ask, why is Taiwan so important? I bet many of us would say, because of chips. Not British chips. Because I saw that in Australia, there are still chips, not fries, which is interesting. I spent maybe too long a time in Texas, and chips in Texas would make people laugh. They're a technological aspect of life. But my jokes aside, it's not about chips. Actually, the US and China, they got close to war because of Taiwan 3 times already. They even fought inside the Taiwan Strait twice. When was that? Twice in the 50s, 1950s, that is. Once in the 90s, 1990s, while our good friend Francis Fukuyama was proclaiming the end of history. And how many chips were being produced in Taiwan back then? I'll tell you, none. Not even one. Taiwan started producing chips in 2004. So I'm figuring that Taiwan is not important because of technology. Yeah, of course, technology makes things more dangerous. But that's not the main reason that gets Taiwan into the league of the most important territories of the world. What is it? It's a geographical position. Nothing less than that. If we were to look at Taiwan, Taiwan is 160 kilometers away from the Chinese coast. But even more complicated than this, Taiwan controls some islets, small ones, and a couple of them are less than 10 kilometers away from the Chinese coast. Considering that Taiwan is still close to the US, as seen from China, you have the US Navy basically inside your own house. That's what makes Taiwan so important. And also, let's look at the world from China again. If you are China and you have to consider the Americans and as a partner, but also someone that I'm sure I'm not telling you something you don't know. A partner, but also a country that has fought many, many wars. We're not talking about a country that does not know what war is. If you were to deal with the Americans, you cannot take for granted that them being in Taiwan does not mean they're aggressive. To me, they're not, especially not today. To explain that to the Chinese, more complicated. They cannot trust that. At least not trust that forever. That's what makes Taiwan so important. Is war something that could happen there? That's the main question of our time, I guess. Probably not. Of course, that's not a no. But why is probably not? To me, at least. And then I'll finish with this thought here. The first reason is that China has never landed on a foreign or another soil, because it's not foreign to China, since the 17th century. And if we were to be even more honest than this, When, in the 17th century, China got Taiwan, it was not even China that got it. It was a part of the Ming Dynasty that was resisting the takeover of China from, or actually by, the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty is the last imperial dynasty of China. When they were getting in power, when they were starting to dominate China, a small part of the Ming Dynasty resisted, and some of them sailed to Taiwan where they tried to wage a resistance. They got defeated, and Taiwan from that time got into mainland China for the first time. And if we were to be even more precise than this, the only time that China itself tried to make a landing, a military landing on another island. Oh, by the way, that's the most complicated military campaign of all. There's nothing more complicated military-wise than landing on another island or territory from the sea. Saving Private Ryan. That's the most complicated part of a war, because it's very difficult, it's very dangerous. There's going to be a lot of dead soldiers, even among the ones that win the battle. And China has never, not even once in their history, succeeded in such military campaign. In the 13th century, China tried to invade Japan. But they weren't Chinese for real. They were Mongols. They were dominating China. Then the kamikaze saved Japan. Kamikaze in Japanese is the wind of destiny because of this. That's the main reason, or the first reason why, to me, a war gets complicated because of Taiwan. The second and last reason is that China, and I know there are very important, prestigious Chinese people here. They know this much better than I do. China's population is getting old. When Henry Kissinger flew to Beijing, China's median age was 19 years old. You know that Kissinger, he wanted to meet Mao. It was a dream. He had said so many times. And finally, he met Mao. They got along pretty well because they had a common enemy, the Soviet Union. As I said, Kissinger used to be coercive and brilliant, and he used to ask complicated questions, not only about the French Revolution. When he was talking with Mao, he asked a very simple and coercive question. What's China's main problem? As if I were to visit you at your house for the first time, and while seated at the table of your kitchen, I were to ask you, what's this family's main problem? Mao, of course, didn't even blink the eyes. He replied right away. And in the translation, this time the translation was correct. Mao's reply sounded like this: too many Chinese. Then he made a pause, and he added, and too young. Kissinger laughed. He said, no, I'm being serious. What's China's main problem? And Mao said, I'm being serious. There are too many and too young. Oh, by the way, do you want some of them? Of course, Mao was not only joking. He was poking Kissinger, considering America's racism towards Asian people. Just like Australia, the US, as you all know, for many decades, forbid Asian people from migrating to the US. The Asian Exclusion Act was called. That's the main reason why Brazil, for example, has got the biggest Japanese population outside of Japan. Mao, of course, knew about this and was teasing his guests, but he was also telling the truth. Back then, Chinese people were many and very young. Nowadays, China's median age is 39 years old. As far as we know, China is the country in the world that has grown and aged so fast because of the policy of one child and so forth. Why am I telling you this? Because to wage a major war, considering that if there were to wage a war around Taiwan, the US would be obliged, I think so at least, would be obliged to respond militarily, not only them. Also, I think the other country from the quadrilateral dialogue, security dialogue, that I bet you all know, considering that Australia is a fundamental part of it, fundamental member of the Quad, alongside the US, of course, Japan and India, but also the European countries, the UK, France, Italy especially. But to wage a major war is something that what history says, that has to do with youngsters. China's got 1,400,000,000 people. If you were to gather people to wage war, you would do so very easily. It's not a matter of sheer numbers. It's a matter of psychological burden. I hail from the oldest country in the world. Italy's median age is 47. Only Japan has got our median age. As a matter of fact, polls tell us that 97% of Italians want peace, which is a noble prospect. But they want peace because they're also very old. When it comes to Ukraine, polls say that Italians, 90% of them, they want peace no matter who wins, no matter who loses, no matter what territorial gains or losses are. Peace, which translates into leave us alone. We're old. War is something that, when it happens, unfortunately, that gets as a burden on the entire population. So China might be getting too old to sustain a major war. Or maybe, as they say, Taiwan will return to China peacefully by 2049, and we won't witness a war, or Taiwan will stay where it is. I know there are many other aspects in the Indo-Pacific we should try to tackle and talk about tonight that I left on the site, but I know there's a Q&A session here being heralded by Professor Flake, so I'll sit down and thank you.
Well, Dario, thank you. That was a tour de force. A couple quick conclusions. Number one, the Perth U.S. Asia Center needs a really flashy sign from Ukraine like the Italian consulate has out front. So if you haven't seen it yet, that's amazing. Number two, we need a really flashy video like the Italian consulate's put together. And number three, it's sometimes very useful for us to hear perspectives like we've just heard from Professor Fabbri. The Perth U.S. Asia Center in the last 11 years has run countless programs. Most of them are well-known friends from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Japan, from Korea, from this region, and we're learning more detailed information. And I found your remarks almost meditative, right? As there were different perspectives, not all of which I would agree with, but there were useful ways for us to kind of think differently about the world. So I really appreciate that. We've only got about 20 minutes, maybe 15 minutes for kind of a question and answer. So I'm not going to go and dominate this conversation further. I'd welcome any specific questions that the audience might have to Professor Fabbri to get his insights. It is useful to have a different point of view coming out of the academic and policy community in Italy. I think your final comments on demography, for just a second when you said Italy is the oldest country in the world, and I thought maybe you might, that's a strange thing to be saying in Australia. But then you quickly clarified that you were talking about the age of the median population is quite good. So I really appreciate that. Anyone in the audience have a quick question? We got a microphone there in the far back there, that gentleman there, and then we'll come up here next.
Professor Fabbri, Andrew Duncan, Institute of Public Administration. Thank you for your remarks.
Thank you.
You commented about the islands that intersperse between Taiwan and the mainland of China. What is your perspective on the Pacific islands that intersperse between China and the USA mainland?
Okay. Thank you. Are we going to gather other questions?
No,
okay.
Let's try to get as many as possible, kind of short, pithy answers. So
Okay.
the Pacific in that.
Okay. By the way, I'm not a professor, just a humble editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Review, but I'll try to reply to your question. What do you mean about those islands? You want to know how important they are, whether they could get into the middle of the action or something else? Well, psychologically, okay. Well, the Pacific Islands, I'd say the Pacific Ocean was one of the main reasons the Second World War began, because the Second World War was not only about Europe, even though, of course, it started in Europe. Germany invaded Poland, even though we should consider that we call it Second World War, but because we're Westerners, again, the Chinese do not call it this way. Not even Japan, for example, but that's another story. But even though the U.S. and Japan, they were vying for the control of the Pacific maritime routes, especially around those islands. And nowadays, we're witnessing something similar, even though less dangerous, I would say, something that can now be compared to Taiwan, at least not from my point of view. I think that the main object of tension are the Senkaku Islands. Of course, we're not in the Pacific Ocean, or among, especially, or even Paracels Islands. Those are, to me, the main archipelagos, contested ones between China, Japan, but also Vietnam, the Philippines, and so forth. I do not believe that those islands are, as I said, as important as Taiwan, and we're not even the Pacific Ocean. They're, as I said, let's say in front of China, to be very obvious. They're important, but Taiwan to me is more important, and I would focus more on Taiwan than on those islands, to be honest with you.
Thank you. Up here in the front, we have Elisa.
Thank you, Alica Kizekova, Curtin University. I appreciated your remarks. I spent some time in Prague, so I just relocated to Perth. I have two specific questions. One is about Italy's, I guess, positioning in Indo-Pacific. I saw Meloni engage at the Raisina dialogue in India, so there's a lot of closeness. Now, Italy said they're withdrawing or leaving BRI, but there is some kind of an effort to relaunch relations with China. So what is the agenda? I find it a bit confusing. And then we've just had wrap-up of the GlobSec conference in Prague, where von Leyen was clearly making some statements about EU's role. And the Australians actually from Canberra visiting are making big declarations how much they wish for EU to be more involved in Indo-Pacific, which I see not very viable. EU doesn't have a muscle. So how do you clarify this positioning of Italy and EU in Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you. Well, you mentioned Italy as, I don't know if everyone is adjourned on this. Italy was at first one of the countries that signed the memorandum on the One Belt, One Road. Then Italy just a few months ago withdrew from the One Belt, One Road memorandum. Actually, technically, we did not. We announced that we won't renew it. But as you said, Prime Minister Meloni, she flew to India not long ago just to, I would say, not to make amends. There's nothing to make amends about. Just to revive our trade relationship with China. What happened? Italy signed that memorandum in 2019, March 2019. We are an economics-driven country. Italy is a country that really believed that the history was over. It still believes that the history was over, that it all revolves around the economy. So when we signed the memorandum, and it was not the Meloni's government back then, of course, when we signed that memorandum, we thought it was only a matter of economy. Then the Americans swung by Italy. They said, well, yeah, but not 100% sure that it's only about the economy. In April 2019, Libya to Italy, Libya, Albania, Germany are the three most important countries geographically wise for Italy. In Libya, as you all know, there's a civil war raging. There's been a civil war raging for 13 years now. A part of the country called Cyrenaica was moving towards Tripolitania, where the Italians are and were. And in April 2019, right after we signed the memorandum, a so-called general, with the backing of Saudis, Russians, France, Emirates, United Arab Emirates, he and his soldiers, they were moving against the Italians and Tripolitania. And the American Command for Africa, which, by the way, is happily based in Germany, in Stuttgart, stated that they won't get involved, meaning we will not get involved in assisting Italy in its own defense, which doesn't sound very strange. Who saved Italy back then? To be honest, they did not save us. Turkey. Turkey intervened with their drones, especially. Drones that are, as you all know, devised by Erdogan's son-in-law. They are the very same drones that bombed Russian tanks at the onset of the war in Ukraine when they were jamming to enter Kyiv. Those drones saved Italy, but not the US. They were very clear that they were not getting involved especially right after we signed that memorandum. And that's something that our governments got very, very clearly. So that's complicated, as you said, but that's Italy's position. We tried to consider what is basically a counter-globalization. The One Belt Road is just something as of revolving around the economy. Someone else for us explained that it's not the case. As for the EU, that's a very quick reply. The EU is not a state, it's not a power, is a free trade area that likes to play as if it was a state or a power or a government. But of course it's not, so I wouldn't take it very seriously, especially when you talk about the Indo-Pacific. If we talk about the economy and trade, yes, the European Union is a serious thing. When we talk about something more related to power, it's a place where different countries tend to, they try at least to coordinate their own interests. But it's not a nation. It's not a power issue, as I guess you implied when you were asking the question.
Okay, we've got time for maybe one final question, and I've got it. There's not somebody immediate there. This gentleman in the back there. right there behind you. I think right behind you there, in the very far back there. I think it's Dario who has a question for Dario. There
Hi,
we go.
Dario. I have a question. I heard that there is an Italian aircraft carrier doing exercise in the Indo-Pacific. I have some ideas, but what do you make of that? Do you have any opinions?
You can tell us your own ideas. We're open to them.
Well, I don't know, signaling something and preparing or show that they are prepared.
Well, Italy's got one of the best navies in the world. Italy's got a 1.5 aircraft carrier. How many countries do have more than one aircraft carrier in the world? Less than 10. China's got 1.5, just like Italy. How many countries do have a nuclear aircraft carrier? Who does know the answer? 2 countries. Which countries? The US and France, period. So when you have more than one carrier, you have a great navy. Now, Italy doesn't even know what to do with that navy. But and the Italian public does know nothing about the navy. We're a peninsula with no relationship with the sea. We think the sea is a place where you bathe in the summer. That's what we do. For real. Not joking. We got no relationship at all with the sea. We're no Japan. We're no England. We're not the US. But we have a great navy. So we're getting involved in the Indo-Pacific because of this. The problem with is that as I said, our public opinion is not really, let's try to find a way to make it very nicely. Our public opinion is not on board. As I said, we have a 47 million age. We think history is long gone. We believe that world peace will be bestowed on us by the mighty God, and it'll stay this way forever. Even nowadays, we all think in Italy that it's a nightmare, that it'll end. We're living through an age of, I would say, contrasted hegemony. Nothing is forever, especially nothing which is human. To me, the American hegemony will last for maybe 100 years, maybe 100 years, even longer than this. Those are the predictions that I love. The ones where you can predict something in 2 or 3 centuries. You know, when my great sons and daughters, they would say, I don't know, our ancestor wasn't very sharp. Whatever he said, we cannot respond for him. But we're living a contrasted age where major powers, they try to contrast the U.S., something that we weren't used to. We haven't been used to for the past 30 years. We have to get used to it. It's not a nightmare, or maybe it's a nightmare, but we still have to get used to it. And the Italian public is not on board. But I would say European public opinions are still not on board with the new reality. We will try to adjust in the next future.
Well, thank you, Dario. I think you will all agree with me. You probably had things you hadn't heard before, ways of looking at things you hadn't looked at them before. If nothing else, discussions like this are intended to be thought-provoking. And we've been ably guided in that provocation this evening. Very much, I appreciate it. It has been wonderful for us to collaborate together with the Italian Consul General here in Western Australia. Having a consulate here is not just about the rich Italian ancestry and the Italian community in Western Australia. It really is about, as the minister has laid out, the economic and trade relationships we have here. But I would actually probably have a slightly more optimistic view about the Italian involvement in Pitch Black, and that is it's not alone. Italy's involvement is together with the United Kingdom, with France, with Germany, with the United States, with Japan, with Korea, because part of this, from an Australian perspective, is about how do you strengthen a rules-based order, because we don't want to live in a world which is a G2 world. We don't want a makes right kind of world. We want a world that is of systems and standards and norms. And Italy is actually part of those systems, standards, and norms that you laid out very well. So, Mr. Consul General, thank you for your time. I earlier failed to acknowledge Lu Zhou here from the U.S. Consulate as I was giving my credits around there. Let me finish with a commercial. I think many of you may know that the Perth U.S. Asia Center for the last 2 years has been running a micro-credential course on the Indo-Pacific. It's been extremely well received. The second one this year, and the last time it's run this year, just started yesterday. A number of you I know have taken and passed that course. So it's still time if you're interested in doing it. It's a quick 8-week online course on the Indo-Pacific. And I guarantee you, if you take that course, many of the things you heard tonight are going to cause you to question some of the things in the course. And so that is intended to help us understand what we know and what we don't know. The last thing I'll mention about that is that we've been regularly polling participants before the course starts and after it starts about their relative knowledge of the Indo-Pacific, and regularly they rate themselves higher at the beginning of the course than they do at the end of the course. My prediction is today that you came in here thinking, I know about the Indo-Pacific, but Professor Fabbri has made us say, well, I think I better ask him more questions. And so if nothing else, we hope we've inspired you to ask more questions, and we couldn't ask for a better partner to do that than with Consul General Federico. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fabbri, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our apologies to those of you who don't have chairs for, but thank you. Thank you so much.